Hi there, and thanks for joining us. My name is Rebecca Root, and I'm a reporter and senior associate with Devex. And today, as part of these broader conversations that we're having around climate action, we're talking about sustainable and efficient land use and how satellites can play a role in supporting businesses, civil society, and governments as they try to do that. And so a big part of helping those different entities pursue sustainable and efficient land use is access to the right data and the right information. Decision makers need to know how they can best use innovative approaches in the race to net zero emissions and stop further global temperature increases. And this is where satellites and remote sensing can come in. It can play an important role in monitoring changes in the natural environment and can effectively help inform evidence-based targets and decision-making for climate change adaptation and mitigation, including in the food system. So here to tell us a little bit more about that technology and where it fits in the climate space is Stuart Martin, CEO of Satellite Applications Catapult, which is our partner for today's event. Hi, Stuart. Thank you so much for joining us today.
Hi, Rebecca. You're welcome. It's my pleasure.
And so we've been hearing a lot throughout the last couple of weeks about nature-based solutions as a key part of ensuring sustainable land use, production of resources such as food and timber, and preventing biodiversity loss as well. Where do satellites and space technology fit into such initiatives, and then also the broader net zero efforts that are ongoing?
Well, thank you very much. What a very broad question to start with. I think we've all used to now the way that satellites have contributed to our understanding of climate change and some of the challenges of environmental degradation that we've sadly suffered from in recent decades. So there are 54 essential climate variables that all our environment models use, and something like half of those can only realistically be gathered from space. So space is a fundamental part of our system of understanding about the way that we actually use our planet. I think the challenge is now to think about how we can use the insights that space give us to find some of those solutions. So how do we arm those people in business and in government who are trying to tackle some of these problems with the knowledge and the insights and the tools that they need to resolve these fundamental challenges, and that's something that I think we're only really just beginning to get to grips with. From everything from through deforestation, through the way that we use our oceans, through the way that we manage agriculture, there is no doubt that satellites give us that knowledge and insights to the way that we operate now and the way that we need to operate in the future that's going to help us make those transformations.
Great, thank you. And do you have some specific examples of where satellites have been used to generate some really useful, insightful information?
So if we look at, let's look at just the example of the oceans for 1 second. I mean, that's a classic nature-based service that's being provided that helps us tackle climate change, or helps us resilience to climate change, just because of the way the oceans absorb carbon dioxide. But the way that we've been putting our oceans under pressure for the last many decades are putting that system at risk. And the way that we are, in particularly the way that we are overcatching and taking biomass out of the oceans through fishing unsustainably. And so we've been actually, when the Satellite Applications Catapult started 8 years ago, we started looking at the oceans as one of the first areas where we thought we could make a difference, because satellites are the only real way that you can see what's going on in the oceans. There are no closed circuit TVs, there's no communications infrastructure, and there are precious few vessels out there most of the time. So it's very hard to see what's going on. And what we were able to see was that by using satellite data, we could build up a picture of the way that the global fishing industry operated. We could see, by applying machine learning to the data that we were capturing, you could see, how fishermen were behaving, what fish they were actually catching. So it made it quite easy to see whether they were doing that in areas they were allowed to catch, or whether they were doing it in compliance with the licenses that they had. And you could see whether there was, transshipments of fish out at sea going on. So maybe where fish that wasn't caught illegally was getting moved into was being moved into a more verifiable supply chain. And so there's all sorts of things that you could see up there, so that for the first time, those of us who are trying to tackle this issue of illegal fishing, to tackle the issues of biomass reduction, had some tools to be able to do it. And so we've been working with partners like Sainsbury's and other supermarkets and the Consumer Goods Forum to try and deploy these tools and reduce the challenge of illegal, unregulated and unregistered fishing.
Great, thank you very much. And do you think, that's a great example of satellites and use in satellite technology, but do you think enough organizations are aware that such solutions are possible, and do you think they're engaging with that technology enough?
Well, I think that's genuinely the challenge. I think people, like I said, they're used to satellites informing the science, but they don't think about space technology and satellite as a tool that is there available for their use. And I think once we start to have conversations with people and they start to think about how they can use space and the way that might change the way that they address the problem, then we start to have very productive and very different types of conversations. An example now is that we're working again with the Consumer Goods Forum and other partners from some of the world's largest retailers to look at deforestation and how we can apply some of the same thinking that we've developed for the oceans into the management of our forests. How can we provide supermarkets with the tools that they need to ensure that they're not inadvertently bringing in illegally deforested wood into their supply chains, or through their procurement of soy or cacao or whatever it is, are they encouraging deforestation through the behavior of their supply chain in ways that they don't understand? So now that we know and they know that the consumers, we want that assurance that we're not depleting the environment through the purchases that we make. How do the supermarkets provide that assurance? And space technology is providing options for that.
And what about those working in the development sector or NGOs? Are they using this technology enough, or are there any reservations that they might have in doing so?
Well, the great thing about space technology is let's start with the downside. People think about space as being very expensive technology, and it's not something that's people in a developing economy are going to be able to leverage in order to start developing their own solutions. But the reality is actually the costs of access to space and the costs of getting data from space are dramatically lower than they ever have been. And there are ways now that organizations working in developing countries, maybe supported by the NGOs or some of the aid organizations, they can use space technology. They can use space data to help them understand how their environment is changing in response to maybe some of the positive interventions that they're making, trying to understand, is it having the impact that we think it's going to have? If yes, great, let's do more of it. If no, okay, well, what tweaks do we need to make so that we're getting better outcomes? And that's available now. People can start using it, and the hope is that will start accelerating some of these grassroots, ground up interventions in the local economies where the new jobs are needed and the economic development is needed to actually take a leading role in developing some of these these solutions to climate change. I think that's one of the things that's most exciting.
And what would you say to encourage its use for these people that maybe are a little bit worried or just have some reservations about engaging with such a different technology?
I think the situation is so serious now. We've all got to be open to all possible options, and please open your minds a little bit and just think beyond what your day-to-day experience has been today, and just look at the art of the possible. I think there's no doubt that we need to do things now that we've never thought of before. Otherwise, we're not going to be successful. So let's take that extra conceptual leap and find those solutions. And it's clear to me that space has that huge potential to make a difference all around the world.
Great, I like that. Thank you. And as you said, you've got a satellites applications catapult has a whole wealth of experience in this space. Off the back of that, are there some key lessons that you've learned that might be useful for others when it comes to engaging satellite and such technology in this way?
Yeah, I mean, there are lessons, and one of the things that we know from from satellites, from the use of satellites, is that in order to get the best value and the best use out of satellite data, sometimes you have to make some pretty profound changes to the way that industries work and the way that industries are governed. Or sometimes you need to introduce new ways of governance in order to be able to, to get the value of the use of satellite data. And that takes a bit of time and effort, but it really is worth it. It's rarely going to be the case that you can provide a very quick fix solution to just sort of to provide a bit of data that will have a massive improvement. But that does happen sometimes. But very often it's about how do we use the insights that we get from space to change the way that an industry works and change the way that an industry is governed. And ultimately, that we all know that that's what we need to do. It's how do we do those two things in parallel? So it's not easy, but it does deliver really tremendous results.
Great. And have there been any instances where it's completely led to a systems change?
There have, absolutely. If we look at, for example, the way that working with a number of supermarkets and working with the European Commission, as it happens, out in Thailand, where there were some real challenges with unsustainable fishing out in that region, not because of any lack of will of the government out there, but just because there was not an effective system of governance in place. And so, what we've been able to do through the Ocean Mind Organization, working with the Thai government authorities and the European Commission and all the supermarkets, is put a system in place there that enables the system to be monitored and tracked, and everyone have greater confidence in the probity of the way that fishing happens. And so, so that means that the consumers can then have more confidence around that too. And I think that that process is now being followed in other places too.
That's great. I'm actually based in Bangkok, so that'll give me some confidence whenever I'm buying some fish. So thank you.
Very good.
And looking ahead, are there some future uses of such technology that maybe aren't in play yet, but you're really hoping to see in the future?
Oh, well, that's a really good question. I mean, I think the really exciting thing is that there are some great minds coming now towards to the challenge of climate change and sustainable governance of our planet. And what I've come to learn over the last 20 years is that it's sort of not what I think that matters. It's the ideas that people come to, particularly when they have very clear insights into the challenges that different industries face. I mean, I'm a space guy. I've worked my entire career in the space technology, and I can project what space technology can do. But it's only once you have a conversation with somebody who's saying, "Well, I've got this very particular problem, and yes, it seems a bit like this problem that you solved over here. But can we have a conversation about how we might be able to use space technology in a completely new way to solve this problem that that nobody's really thought about before?" So it's that coming together of experts, in the retail sector, in the farming sector, in the mining sector, or whatever it is, the people who understand the challenges, where the risks and the threats are coming from, and then getting those talking to the space industry specialists, and then having those those revolutionary conversations that will deliver those answers. So I think there's all sorts of exciting prospects.
And so with that in mind, would you have a final call to action or a key message specifically for those in the development community?
Take a look at space. Rule nothing out. Don't think of space as being, that's where we go to Mars, or that's where we look at distant planets. Actually, and by developing that technology to look outwards, we can also make it look inwards, and that gives us tremendous insights into the way that our own world functions. And yes, that informs science, and it informs the understanding of how the world works, but it can also inform businesses and anybody who's working in this space, trying to tackle some of these insidious problems of climate change and environmental degradation. And we can use those insights to make progress faster. So please do give it a go.
Well, thank you so much, Stuart, for joining us today. It's been really great to have your insights be part of this this big conversation, especially this week around COP26. So thank you.
I'm delighted to be here. It's been a pleasure speaking with you, Rebecca.
Now, to open up the conversation a little bit, I'm going to invite our 4 panelists to join us. We've got Alistair Fury, co-founder and CEO of Silvera, Crystal Davis, director of the Global Forest Watch at World Resources Institute, and Raquel Moses, who's actually coming to us from Glasgow COP26. She's the CEO of the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator and UN Global Ambassador in the Race to Zero. And then Maria Adelada Fernandez, National Program Coordinator in Colombia for the Earth Innovation Institute. Thank you all so much for joining us today. It's great to have you. And so, yeah, we're talking about this idea of efficient and sustainable land use. And one thing that I didn't know until this week was that land use is actually a big carbon emitter, responsible, I think, for around 23% of emissions, which, yeah, was just staggering to me. And so, Alistair, I want to come to you and ask that. Well, I know that a big part of Silvera's mission is providing data to help land to not be such a big emitter. Why is it so big in the first place?
I mean, I think it's just a simple function of 2 things, really. One, natural carbon sinks are huge. So forest, soil in particular, there's just an enormous amount of carbon locked up in those places. And then the second thing is basically the incentives that hold currently strongly incentivize economically actors to diminish the amount of carbon in those sinks. So basically what that means is people are economically advantaged typically by cutting down forest, by replacing mangrove with fish ponds, by managing farmland in such a way that the amount of organic matter in the soil gets lowered. So basically the emissions from these natural systems are just driven by economic incentives, basically, and the size is just because there's just an enormous amount of carbon been locked in there over the millennia, and you know that's really our mission, is to basically help to shift those incentives by providing the data so that those kind of negative externalities can be priced effectively, and people can be rewarded for protecting and restoring those natural sinks.
Great, thank you. So I guess the system is really stacked against anyone that wants to try and do more sustainable land use.
Precisely.
Raquel, what are some of the knock-on effects that you've seen of poor and inefficient land use?
Sure, certainly we're seeing lower crop yields, we're seeing changes in the agricultural system and our threats to our food security. We're seeing greater landslides, because we're having so many changes in terms of the precipitation as a result of climate change. We're seeing landslides and flooding and all sorts of things related to poor land use. And so we have to get this right. We are championing 30 by 30 protection of 30% of the land and ocean by 2030. And we think that would be a huge component of helping nature to regenerate and having it return to being a carbon sink. The challenge with that is that it's costly, protecting the land, mapping out the areas and determining what needs to happen, all have costs associated with it. And as Alistair pointed out, you make the money by using the land, or at least that's how it's been up until now. And so we are working on some new solutions that allow us to allow nature to regenerate and to price that in, to use those ecosystem services as an opportunity to generate income that can then support the better land use.
And do you think enough people, Raquel, are taking this approach and thinking about it? Or is it an issue that's just not widely known about enough?
Not widely enough, certainly. And certainly even within sort of the farming community and the agricultural community across the region, there is not enough access to information about appropriate land use and what that could mean in terms of the future challenges that we will face. But we find that in general, globally, people are taking a lot of immediate decisions without thinking about the long-term implications. So we have to find ways to help them to benefit in the short term while also keeping an eye on what are the long-term kinds of activities that we want to promote and support.
Great, thank you. And Crystal, coming to you, I know that you lead the Land and Carbon Lab at WRI. Can you talk a little bit more about nature-based solutions? I know it's a topic that we're hearing so much of these last few weeks. How key are they to tackling this monumental challenge we face in terms of climate change, and where does better land use fit into that conversation?
Absolutely. So, I think estimates vary, but most seem to agree that the land sector accounts for about a quarter of global greenhouse gas emissions. So addressing land sector emissions is absolutely critical to keeping us on a 1.5 degree pathway. And nature-based solutions, which essentially involve conserving, restoring, better managing land and natural ecosystems, are estimated to provide over 30% of the mitigation solution needed by 2030. And this is because not only is land a source of emissions, but it's also a huge carbon sink. So when we manage land and natural ecosystems well, then they can pull more carbon out of the atmosphere. And I think one of the reasons why natural solutions to climate change are so appealing is because they're also thought to be one of the most affordable and cost-effective mitigation options. But on the flip side of that, emissions from land are much harder and often more expensive to monitor compared to other sectors. And I think it's partly as a consequence of this monitoring challenge that we've seen a disproportionately small amount of climate finance going towards nature. I think the estimate's around 3% of all climate finance going towards nature-based solutions. And if we really want investors to unleash the billions that they have now committed for nature, we need data that will help them invest with confidence and integrity. And that means better data that allows us to understand how land is being used and what the consequences of that land use is for emissions and removals of carbon.
And when you say data, what kind of data are you talking about?
Yeah, I think we need high resolution geospatial data that allows us to understand these trends in specific local places, but also how these land use trends unfold over the entire world and larger regions. Because ultimately we have a finite amount of land on Earth, and we're seeing rising competition for that land. So we're expecting the global population to reach 10 billion by 2050. And those people are going to demand more food, more fuel, more fiber. We've modeled that means we're going to need more agricultural land by an area twice the size of India. And at the same time, the IPCC is telling us we can't convert any more forests into agriculture. In fact, we need to do more than that. We need to restore agricultural lands back into forests to pull more carbon out of the atmosphere. So this land squeeze is something that we're really going to address if we understand land use dynamics both locally and globally.
And do you think that's something that enough global leaders understand and connect with?
No, I think we definitely need more communication around this issue. And I think that data can really help make that case to both politicians on getting on global scales and local scales.
And I'll let you off the hook in a minute, but I did want to ask about the system that you're working on that's monitoring the world's land and its nature-based carbon. What can you tell us about that work?
Yeah, so in 2014, WRI, Google, University of Maryland, and other partners launched Global Forest Watch, which allows us to monitor deforestation at high resolution and in near real time around the world. And that's been highly successful. We see incredible uptake of this information. I think as we speak, the users of GFW are collectively monitoring over 600 million hectares of tropical rainforest. And we've seen a growing body of evidence showing that this monitoring makes a difference in terms of affecting deforestation rates on the ground. So we're now building on that success and saying we don't just want to monitor forests, we want to monitor all the world's land. And I've really seen this working on the forest issue. You can't stop deforestation monitoring the forest alone. You also need to monitor the broader land use dynamics, like the expansion of agriculture, mining, roads, et cetera, that are driving deforestation over time.
Great, thanks so much for sharing that with us. And Maria, I want to come to you and ask you about geospatial data. From your work, where do you see it fitting into this issue? And is it something that's been utilized enough of yet?
Thank you. Yeah, it's paramount. It's very, very important. As Alistair and Crystal already said, we really need very good information, data to show that effectively these changes in the way we use land are reducing, capturing carbon emissions or keeping carbon in these sinks and not releasing it to the atmosphere. So it's very important. And from my work with these subnational jurisdictions in Colombia, we don't only work at the jurisdictional level, like with departments, that's the name they have in Colombia, but also with, for example, producers association. Because as Alistair said, it is very important to be able to show what is like the marginal effect, how the changes in the way you're using the land transforms or translate into tons of carbon reduced. And specifically, the tools that Global Forest Watch have are very easy to use. We've been working with this Cacao Producers Association in one of the most heavily deforested municipality in Colombia, in the Amazon region. They are really committed to producing deforestation-free cocoa, and they want to be able to see it themselves and to be able to show the results to their potential buyers. And they want to be able to make that, to add value to the product they're producing. And I think that's very, very interesting that they're doing this. They have this initiative, and Global Forest Watch, it's something that they can use, and they've been using it, and it's easy, they can understand it, and they are actually changing the incentives because they're paying a little bit more for a kilogram of cocoa to those producers that really are not deforesting inside their farms. So they're being able to do it themselves, and I think that's very empowering. And the monitoring tools that we have at a country level are not updated as quickly as Global Forest Watch, and they are not as easy to use by people like these small producers in these areas in Colombia.
Yeah, that's really interesting that you highlight the easy to use part, because I imagine that people hear the word like geospatial, satellite, space data, and it just sounds so overwhelmingly complex and scary, like that the average person wouldn't be able to utilize that. So is it really something that is that simple that anybody can utilize?
It's really simple. And the thing is, they've done a lot of work making it easier every time. And also like adapting to the conditions of these places, because these are very remote, very rural communities where you don't have access to internet like anywhere you are. So you're able to get, if you have a smartphone, a very basic smartphone, you can be able to upload all the information into the smartphone, and then the smartphone, when you have internet connection, you can update everything on the web, and then get everything on a place where you can really like monitor, report, have the maps done. It's very easy, and they've been doing it with the technical assistance that they have. They already been doing this monitoring for, it's been like 8 months already. So they are building the history of their farms, and to be able to show like the progress they're making.
And I don't know if you're able to answer this, but are there any lessons that you've learned or that they've learned in utilizing that data that might be useful for other projects that are thinking, hey, maybe this is a route that we should go down to?
Yes. One of the things that's been really remarkable is that since they began, I mean, they did a pilot. They have like 180 associate producers to this producers association, and they've been piloting the first 60 farms. And what they've seen is that being able to show to everyone, and they don't only pay more for this produce that is zero deforestation to the farmers, but they also recognize those farmers that are not deforesting, and they showcase them to the rest. And since these 8 months, deforestation alerts have reduced significantly. So I think is very powerful, because it's also something that allows for collective action to happen. And everyone is like more committed to, okay, yeah, because when they sign for the association, when they become an associate, they are actually, part of what they do is to commit to not deforesting and to conserving the forests that are remaining inside their farms, and also to protecting watersheds and the rivers that they have inside. So with this, it's like strengthening all those commitments and really like seeing what the others are doing, and that motivates them to be more sustainable over time.
Great, thank you. And Alistair, I'm coming back to you to ask how you think geospatial data can help inform decisions, specifically around how best to reach net zero.
Yeah, great. I mean, our domain at Silveris is kind of narrow. It relates to voluntary carbon markets, so you might know them as offsets. And there, the kind of sector has been kind of plagued with concern about accuracy of reporting, about whether the projects are truly additional, and whether they're used for greenwashing by corporates that buy them. So really, our mission is to kind of shed light on that sector, which is kind of a subset of all possible types of nature-based solutions. What the buyers need, and what in fact the sellers need, the entire market really needs, is not just the geospatial data, which is actually a critical component, but they need accounting. So a project will have issued a certain number of credits. It will need those to be verified accurately on a kind of meter by meter basis, and they need that to be in a very standardized way, in a very accessible way. So really what we're trying to distill is a set of data that people in the market can use to transact on, that converts what you have several thousand projects that all look very different, and there's literally each one will have hundreds of pages of documentation. We rate those projects in a very common framework with a very high level of accuracy, and it's one of the things that we've points of feedback we've had from the market is concern about the level of accuracy. Do we capture, is degradation captured as well as deforestation? And we've been going to very great lengths to improve the accuracy of forest carbon measurements. In fact, our team's out in Peru now. We have an active collaboration with UCLA, NASA JPL, and University College London to basically reduce the level of uncertainty in these forest carbon estimates by about a factor of 10. And for us, it might not be possible to do that on a global basis, but it's possible to do that on a project basis. The net effect of this data, the accuracy, and then the wrapping it in the kind of accounting frameworks that the market needs, is then the buyers have confidence that what they're actually buying is real. And what we've seen is a huge amount of interest in the voluntary carbon market from the corporate sector, and the best projects that we rate, they get disproportionately removed from the market. They get a higher price, and the great thing, just to kind of illustrate what the effect is in the kind of net zero context, we've had two partners come to us recently, or almost apologetic, saying, look, we don't need to subscribe till like next year, basically, to your data, because the carbon price has gone up so much that it's cheaper to decarbonize our business. And this is like the best news that we could hear. It's like, this is the last thing you should be apologizing for. This is exactly why we exist, right? Is to make your emissions reductions internally cheaper than buying an offset. That's kind of exactly how it should work. It can set a global carbon price, and it actually drives capital into net zero. So there's an actual, instead of it being a get out of jail card or a greenwashing ticket, it's actually a penalty, and it should always be more expensive to buy an offset than it should be to decarbonize if businesses are doing it right. So and then the other net effect in the market itself is the projects that are doing the most, having the best co-benefits in terms of biodiversity, in terms of their their SDG kind of impact on the local community, local population, they get the best price. And the market can see that, and therefore you're incentivizing the new wave of projects that are coming on stream to be in that sort of top quartile. They're aiming for the absolute best performance in terms of their impact across the board. And that's, again, it's just a virtuous circle where you see, accountability and data driving, best practice. And that's you see that on the market side, on the net zero side, and you see it happening on the project level as well. So it's heartening to see these effects coming true when not being merely theoretical from our side.
Yeah, that must be such a win when that happens. And what about the appetite for this kind of data and information? Is that something that you're seeing increasing at all?
Yeah, I mean, 100% from the buyer's perspective. If you're buying an offset, so some of our customers will be averaging sort of around $100 million or above spend on offsets over the next few years. That level of spend is material from a financial perspective. Like that's significant. You can't get that wrong. And it's interesting that there'd been a presumption that as businesses bought more offsets, they would be more inclined to kind of go for the bargain basement kind of level in terms of quality. Actually, you see the inverse happening. As the spend goes up, the level of scrutiny goes up. And that's typically where our customers are. They're the big buyers of carbon. They want to know what they're getting, and they want to report to their stakeholders that what they're paying for, they are getting, and they're driving that kind of virtuous cycle of quality. So there's, fortunately for us, there is demand for what we do at the moment.
That's great. And Raquel, coming to you to talk a little bit about financing as well. From your experience in strategizing around climate smart investment projects in the Caribbean, how do you think we make nature-based solutions more sustainable financially so that perhaps more people want to invest in them?
Sure. I think, the people who, just to start by saying, the people who are against the carbon market, they don't understand that whether the carbon market exists, the degradation and the deforestation will continue to happen. So this is a way of driving finance into preservation. What we're looking at on the ground is we're working with a company called the Intrinsic Value Group, and they are doing a valuation on ecosystem services that are being provided by a particular plot of land, and then using that to float on a stock exchange. So they've gotten into an agreement with the New York Stock Exchange to be able to float those ecosystem services as an instrument, not dissimilar to sort of a non-fungible token, for example, that people then are willing to buy to ensure conservation. And we see that as one of many different tools that we'd like to use. I completely support Alistair's comments. We want to see people decarbonizing their businesses. But as they make these aggressive targets that we all require to be made, we need them to focus on, yes, decarbonize your business, but if you can't take it the last mile, then purchase some ecosystem services, purchase some carbon credits, do something to be able to meet the commitments that you've set. Because what we're seeing is a lot of will, but not necessarily a lot of action behind that will. And we want to see greater momentum against the action based on the commitments. So we're excited, hopeful, and optimistic. I told me earlier there was a COP in the middle of COP, and that's been happening quite a bit. Because people are demanding action, people are angry, people are frustrated, but I also feel like there have been a lot of new solutions coming to the table, and we need to we can't think about the finance for adaptation as something that is, or finance for mitigation as something that's binary. It is going to require all of the solutions that we have and solutions that we don't yet have, but we can't just say, okay, well, we're going to cherry pick the things that are sort of ideal solutions, because it is going to take a comprehensive effort to bring funding to address the issues that are happening at the moment. So we are hopeful and excited and deliberate about making sure that we are working towards bringing funding for the mitigation that needs to happen.
So yeah, tell us a bit about the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator that you're involved in.
Sure. So we are a collection of 28 countries that are pursuing climate action together. What we do as the Caribbean Climate Smart Accelerator is we create economies of scale across those small island developing states, so that where a country is working on something and that project isn't able to attract financing because it's too small, we try to work across several countries to build the projects that are big enough that they can either attract investment or philanthropy. We also bring funding to the table by creating new kinds of financial instruments and bringing new financial tools to the region. We work with the private sector to be able to help them to fund projects, and we bring innovation to the table by working with entrepreneurs to bring new solutions to bear to the region. What we do is we identify for each of the countries what have their nationally determined contributions been and how are those progressing. In some instances, the NDCs are progressing very well, and where they're progressing well, we get them to work with countries who are working on a similar initiative that isn't going as well, so that they can share best practice. Where it's not going well, we try to find out what are the things that we could potentially bring to the table that might help them. Is it funding? Is it solutions? Is it capacity? And so we bring those things to the table to try and help countries get to their nationally determined contributions. And then we try to get countries to help them to increase their nationally determined contributions, because only by sort of pushing the envelope are we going to get the best possible solutions. So we have some indoor agriculture projects. We've got a solar assembly project. We have a valuation of ecosystem services. We're working on 30 by 30. We have a number of different projects within our portfolio. We have 62 projects that we've developed over time, 12 of which are currently active. And at this COP, we've met with a number of our constituents in an effort to help develop more projects and to get those projects to scale, working with a number of different partners. We work with Rocky Mountain Institute, the Nature Conservancy, and a number of other folks. We are in great collaboration with Virgin Unite and the Virgin Group, who have been tireless in their efforts to support us in meeting our commitments, as well as supporting building resilience in the region. We've developed a resilience scorecard that we've brought to COP this year. And we were really, really excited. The Caribbean Development Bank developed it's a sort of a vulnerability index. I can't remember the name of it at the moment. It's a way of valuing concessionary finance to small island development. So you know, we're bringing a lot to the table and really excited about where we are and what's being developed.
Great, thanks so much for sharing, Raquel. You were coming in and out a little bit there, but I think we picked up the gist of what you were saying. So thank you so much. Crystal, I want to come back to you and ask, you know, in this particular moment, where do we go? Looking ahead, where do we go from here? What needs to happen to accelerate some of these solutions that are out there, this use of the data that's out there? How do we get the global leaders on board?
Sure. I might pick up a bit on some of the comments that Alistair and Maria made. I think it's important to remember that data is a means to an end, and data alone is usually not enough to answer someone's question, because it needs to be analyzed, it needs to be interpreted, often combined with other forms of information which may or may not be geospatial. And that work of turning data into actionable information that decision makers can actually make decisions based on is often neglected by those, I think, who just produce data. And we're hearing a lot right now about more and more data being produced every day. This is a good thing, because we need more. There are still gaps, but I think decision makers are ultimately feeling overwhelmed by this data deluge. So as Maria mentioned, we really need to focus on creating information tools that are easy to use. This is a very iterative process, so we need to listen to the users that we intend to serve. With Global Forest Watch, we spent years and years trying to refine and improve on the tools that we've created so that anyone can use them. And this sort of brings me to another point that data is power, right? So we have to ask ourselves who can access data. And as Maria mentioned, many of the local communities and small farmers who are in remote areas have very limited internet connectivity. So this question of how we reach last mile users and really empower them with information is important. And I think that we need to be investing, for every dollar we invest into new data and technology solutions, we need to be investing $2 into empowering the people we aim to serve with that information. We need to ensure that it's not just the politicians and decision makers at a national level or global level, but also the people on the ground who ultimately manage land and manage our forests and other natural ecosystems.
And do you think the pandemic has in any way impacted this type of work?
Yeah, I think it's made it more challenging for a lot of people who do that on the ground work to go into the field and be where they need to be. But that's also why these types of monitoring tools are even more important now, because it provides people with an eye into the forest, onto the land, without necessarily having to step outside their door. So it's a help. But what we found is that simply providing the data is not enough. You really need to help people understand how it can be used, how it can be worked into their operational systems and protocols, and that sort of full chain of support from receiving the data to acting on it and doing something differently is really critical. And again, how you provide that support to many local people, many local farmers around the world is a big scaling challenge for us.
And Maria, I want to come to you and ask, we've heard a lot about building back better during this pandemic. How do you think we can use this particular moment as an opportunity to kind of accelerate innovation in the blue and the green economy?
Yeah, before I answer that particular question, I just wanted to say something more that I think is really important in what Crystal was saying about giving the right data in a way that can be used by decision makers. There's also another dialogue that we're having in Colombia with the financial sector, because there's a lot of lines of credit that actually can be connected to deforestation, for example, for cattle ranching in the Amazon. And we really need to have something like credit score, but for deforestation or for some environmental indicators that are important. And that's also something that we're trying to build right now for the Colombian financial sector, something like this credit score platforms where you can maybe fill in like a national ID for a land plot, and then you can see what's been happening in that plot. If that plot of land is inside something that in Colombia is called the agricultural frontier, for example, which is the area that can be turned into agriculture, and where the money from the financial sector for the agricultural sector can be used as credits. You cannot lend someone money from those sources outside this agricultural frontier. So data to be able to have a very quick report on what's happening in a land plot is really important, and something that's very easy to use by these credit analysts for different banks in Colombia. And coming back to your question, I think how we can make these opportunities increase are fundamental, and how we can use this data to be able to make these solutions in the green economy, in the blue economy. There's something, I mean, it's a way of connecting. It's a way of connecting the people on the ground that are making the decisions with the people that invest money in those areas, or people who buy products from those areas, or just people that are willing to invest to make the transition to more sustainable practices and development. For example, like the governments and the money that goes to development at the international level, the ODAs and mechanisms like that. So how do you connect those people with all those needs? I think that you need data, you need reliable data, and you need like scalable solutions. And this is, I think, where things are more complex, in the sense that you can do projects, and we've been very kind of successful at doing project level things and being able to quantify the carbon emission reductions or sequestration, and being able to put that in a way that someone can buy those credits on the voluntary market. But we still need to make that scalable. And I think that's where we need more innovation. We need business cases. We need information to be able to show how some investments are not only creating money for the investors, but also co-benefits in terms of carbon or sustainable development or reducing poverty or adaptation to climate change. And I think we still need solutions on that, on how to scale those possible opportunities.
Great. And Raquel, I don't know if you're still there, but if you are, I know you're there, you're at COP, and I want to ask, are some of these solutions being talked about? Is this conversation resonating all with leaders? What do you think?
Yeah, I think it is resonating with leaders, and I just turned off video to make sure I'm preserving bandwidth. But yes, it is resonating with leaders. I think that, but everybody's playing a bit of a game of chicken in that they want to see somebody else move first. And so what we are hoping, and I love this conversation about data, especially Maria and Crystal, talking about the need for data to be accessible, the need for data to be present, and data only being a tool towards an end. But the data is what is going to help us to keep the leaders accountable. So you're seeing people now doubling down on, okay, you've now made this commitment, now what? How do you ensure that this is actually followed through? And what we're calling for at this COP, among other things, is that by mid-December, we have a very, very clear action plan. And the UN announced on Friday that they'd be producing an action plan that then talks about the action that needs to take place. Because while many of these commitments are 2030 and beyond commitments, in order to meet those commitments, there are things they need to do right now. And so we need to understand what are the 10 milestones between now and the next COP that they need to accomplish to be on track. And then what are the next set of milestones between next COP and 2030 on an annual basis that they need to meet in order to follow through on their commitments. And I think data is going to be our key to delivering that.
Yeah, absolutely. It's a lot of talk, isn't it? But it's making that talk into, turning that talk into action that's really going to make a difference.
Yeah, people have been calling it a commitment fest, which, it may be fair, maybe not fair, but certainly we want them to move beyond the commitment fest.
Yeah, absolutely. I like that, commitment fest. It's a good description. Very quickly, I'm going to come to each of you and just ask for your key message, what you want people to take away from this conversation today. So, Alistair, I'll come to you.
Well, I guess our mission is really around transparency and accountability. So, I guess it was already made the point earlier by Raquel. It's good for businesses to have targets on net zero, but they actually have to deliver on them, and they need to be held accountable for that delivery. If they don't, in any given period, meet their target, then they absolutely must, in our view, make themselves whole. Otherwise, the atmosphere and everybody that lives on the planet is shortchanged, right? So that's my key message. And to do that, they need to make sure that those voluntary offsets they buy are genuine and high quality, and account for the ecosystems of the people where those projects are. And if all corporates did that, we'd be in a much better place.
Thanks. And Crystal, coming to you next.
Sure. I think we tend to talk a lot about the role that independent geospatial data can play in creating transparency and accountability in the delivery of nature-based solutions, but I think it's also important to remember that data plays an important role in creating equity as well. So we need to be thinking about not just how we create data, but how we deliver it and who we deliver it to.
Thank you. Maria?
Key takeaways. I would say that we still need to work harder on giving the incentives that are needed for the changes that we need, because the markets, the way they work, normally they are flawed. They don't work very well. Even though if we think that just leaving them do what they do is going to give us the best possible results, that's not how it works. When we want some certain social results that are very important for us all, and climate change is one of those areas where markets normally, the way we were used to them, they don't work. So we need to keep building these incentives. We need to increase the level of data, of information, because information is one of those things where markets normally don't give like to everyone. So data, information, incentives, being able to create that value on keeping forest standing, on carbon, because in the end, it's the forces of the market that are driving deforestation, because people in rural areas, in countries like mine, that's the only way they can make a living. They don't make a living from the forest as it is. They need to transform it into something, grow something, and sell it somewhere. So we need to keep working on making these transitions to markets that work differently and that value things that weren't valued before.
Thank you. And Raquel?
I think we have to be as relentless as climate change is. So what I anticipate and what I'm asking everyone who's watching this or hearing this is to continue to put pressure. So do not let this time change and then you forget about it. You can either follow us at CaribbeanAccelerator.org, or you can follow Climate Watch or any of the number of action groups that are sort of tracking how we're performing. Do not forget about this. This is the beginning of this journey towards get this race to net zero. So please just stay engaged in this transition every single day. Find some way to maintain pressure and momentum. I think this is something that we can do, we must do, we have to do, but it only happens if we all stay engaged.
Great. Well, a perfect note to end on. Thank you so much. Thank you, all of you, for your time, for sharing your insights with us. It's been a real pleasure.
Thanks so much.
Thanks so much.
Thank you.
And so now to go over to my colleague, Vince Chadwick, our Brussels correspondent, who sat down with Lucy Almond, Director and Chair of Nature for Climate, to dig into this topic a little further.
Thanks, Rebecca, and hi, everyone. It's great to be with you, Lucy. Thanks for joining us. Personally, I'd like to start with a little bit about Nature for Climate. And an existential question. Why do you exist? What do you do with how many people and how do you do it? This might be a bit of a scene setter for our audience as well. Thank you.
Yeah, why do I exist? I've asked myself that many times this week up at Glasgow at COP26. So thank you, Vince. Very nice to be here, part of the Devex webinar. So I chair the Nature for Climate Coalition, which is a group of 18 different member organizations of international environmental organizations, UN agencies, and some corporate coalition groups. And we've been around since 2017, and our mission is really to promote the role of nature as a climate solution and to mobilize investment into areas that will enable their acceleration, both public and private sector. And when we started back in 2017, we did some social media monitoring and calculated basically that nature was less than 1% of the climate conversation at that time. And since then, we've been working with governments and companies and civil society groups to help improve the sort of visibility of nature as a climate solution, and then work on some specific projects underneath that. And I think, just to reflect, last week here in Glasgow, the major announcements that were made around forests and finance and agriculture and other nature-based solutions, I feel like nature has been a real central theme to this COP, partly due to the UK government's work on incorporating nature at the heart of the COP. But I think, it really, really does feel different in terms of momentum this week.
And you mentioned when we were chatting earlier about the kind of meetings you've been having. I mean, I can only imagine what your calendar looks like this week, and thanks for making time for us. But which of the meetings and companies and actors you've been meeting with have got you really excited in terms of what people are doing around nature-based solutions for climate change?
Yeah, there's been, I'd sort of answer that in two ways, really. And on the main stages, there have been a series of really big announcements from governments and companies that have mobilized around $20 billion in total for investment into different types of nature-based solutions, primarily forest and finance related announcements to try and stop deforestation, particularly in the tropical regions. And that in itself has just felt like a huge moment of turning the tide on deforestation, as long as obviously the pledges are implemented and the companies are held accountable, which is always a big if. But in terms of the scale of the announcements, that's been the most exciting thing, I think, for me at COP. But separately, and outside of perhaps those main stage sessions, we've been coming across a whole wealth of startup companies that are working on nature-based solutions, particularly in the area of technology. And this relates to the sort of nature tech work stream that Nature for Climate started this year. And that's really exciting personally. I hosted a panel session that had Will Marshall, the CEO of Planet Labs, and Amazon's Sustainability Data Initiative, and the Thomas Crowther from Crowther Labs, and Kat Bruce from Nature Metrics. And it was a really exciting discussion around nature, climate, and technology, and the nexus of this coming together. How can technology help enable nature-based solutions and ensure, but do so in a way that actually ensures carbon storage is permanent and biodiversity is monitored and tracked, and that Indigenous communities and local peoples are also brought in to these solutions and not excluded.
Could you give us a flavour about what some of this looks like in practice and some of the projects that are ongoing at the moment?
Yeah, sure. I think, a good example is, so one announcement that happened on Saturday was from WRI, Google and Unilever. So they announced new funding towards their remote sensing project that uses data to detect deforestation within Unilever's supply chains. So actually applying all the technology that exists at the moment in terms of satellite imaging and advanced artificial intelligence to be able to track deforestation within their commodity sourcing. And a lot of the conversations that have been happening are saying, there's been a lot of work looking at commodity supply chains in the last 10 years, but this technology is a potential game changer here in terms of both the satellite imaging availability, but also how you can apply artificial intelligence to that to help model and track, predict, monitor, verify, and help, sort of keep these companies accountable. As one good example, the World Economic Forum announced its uplink winners this week. So it had 12 winners of startup companies that are working specifically on carbon markets and nature. And within that, there were a couple of really exciting companies. So Chloris Geospatial uses satellite data and artificial intelligence again to help companies invest in nature-based solutions in a confident way. And then there was a regenerative agriculture one called Soilify, I think, that monitors the soil carbon change using high resolution satellite data and machine learning. So there's lots of these sort of companies springing up. And at the moment, it feels like I saw a report from Impact Alpha that said $17 billion of funding has gone into climate tech in the first half of 2021, which is a huge amount of money. I don't see that at the moment, that scale of investment into what we call nature tech. And I think that's where there's huge potential to grow that area.
I'd be interested, maybe it's a too technical topic to get into here and now, but the delineating between nature tech and climate tech, this has probably been an ongoing struggle for you. How do you draw the line?
Well, I mean, mostly the reason we started the nature tech work stream was because we saw there wasn't a lot of attention on it. There's two reasons, really. One, because we feel that technology can help build trust in nature-based solutions, because some of the issues around trust for nature-based solutions come down to accountability, monitoring, verification, and technology can play a very big role there. But technology can also help attract finance to nature-based solutions. And so it feels like there is a lot of attention on pure tech for climate. And when people think about tech, they think about, carbon capture and storage or geoengineering or other sort of advanced forms of technology that might support climate change. And there is an awful lot of attention on that. Again, I saw the World Economic Forum announce something called the First Movers Coalition this week. And that was very much focused on big companies being able to develop completely new technologies that will help climate change. And nature wasn't a part of that. So I just feel like there's this sort of emerging area where we can point to some good examples, draw attention to it, and help bring these tech entrepreneurs to the problems of nature-based solutions specifically, focusing not just on climate, but also importantly on the biodiversity crisis that we face at the same time.
I mean, COP is in lots of ways a bit of a numbers game with the climate finance target of 100 billion and things like that. That there's these that advocates are often drawn to, and obviously there's always a question of limited resources. What have you encountered much resistance or pushback to this idea of focusing on nature tech now, at a time when we also need to be doing a lot to cut industrial emissions, and that's a very lively conversation. Something that I follow, and we follow my colleagues at Devex as well, is multilateral development bank support for fossil fuels and things like that. So there's lots of different aspects to the climate debate. What's your response to those who say that focusing on natural solutions to meet the Paris Agreement is actually a distraction from the main game, which should be preventing the effects of industrialization on the climate?
Yeah, I mean, we've been dealing with that issue not just this week, but for the last couple of years. And I think the simple answer is you need both. Every single science report that has come out, whether it's from the IPCC or others, has pointed to the fact there is no pathway to 1.5 degrees without dealing with emissions from the land use sector. So that means both reducing emissions from agricultural and land use sector, but also using the natural facility for forests and other land use to be able to store and draw down carbon. And so certainly within Nature for Climate, we have always said that nature-based solutions have to occur alongside rapid decarbonisation. And everybody that I speak to up here and outside it is stressing the issue that decarbonisation has to happen first and fastest and foremost. But if you don't do the nature-based solutions bit, you won't get to 1.5 degrees. So it's not an either or, it is a both and. They have to be done at the same time. And in the next 10 years, it is particularly important to deploy financing to nature-based solutions, because otherwise you actually start to lose some of those natural carbon sinks. And so this next 10-year time frame is particularly important for nature-based solutions. And we've had a Greenpeace protest up here at our Nature Zone pavilion this week, and Greta arrived. So it's a really, really topical issue. And we believe very, very strongly that you have to have the investment in nature-based solutions at the same time. And many companies are actually, they get this and they're looking at both. I haven't come across many companies at all that are thinking, great, well, we'll just plant some trees and forget all this other stuff, because that is obviously the criticism that comes our way. And we can talk a little bit more maybe about some of the challenges of focusing on tree planting as well.
We've got only a few minutes to go. I just wonder what happened with that protest. How did it? Because sometimes, as we saw with Elon Musk and the head of the World Food Programme, sometimes there's a moment, and then it's actually the continuation of that conversation which can lead to change. So is there going to be any follow up, or do you have the sense that the two sides are kind of talking past each other at the moment?
Yeah, I mean, we did. So we invited Jennifer Morgan from Greenpeace into the session. So it was actually a session focused specifically on voluntary carbon markets. And the interesting thing here is that nature-based solutions is much, much bigger than just carbon markets. The finance from carbon markets is a small fraction of what is needed to turn the tide on the destruction of nature. So currently at the moment, I think the stats are there's 40 times more money going into destroying forests than there is going into actually saving forests. And that huge chunk of money is what we were talking about at the beginning, around this 20 billion figure. So carbon markets is a small fraction of how you can mobilize finance to go into nature-based solutions. That is a particular flashpoint for the environmental community. And so at that voluntary carbon markets initiative, we invited Jennifer Morgan from Greenpeace and ActionAid to come into this session and make their point clear. And there was still the protests going on outside. And I think that discussion will continue, definitely. The invitation is there. It's very important that we talk to Indigenous groups and bring them into any discussions about the scaling of the carbon markets. And then, I mean, there will always be, I think that, that the two sides do not really see each other's point of view, if I'm honest. So the debate will continue, we hope. Whether we can get to resolution on that, I think, probably not. But certainly everybody involved in the Voluntary Carbon Markets Initiative is working to engage and bring Indigenous groups and other detractors into that conversation to ensure that the mistakes of the past aren't made.
Okay, well, one to watch. As a journalist, we love never-ending debates as well, of course, because it gives us something to write about, and we'll keep writing about it. Plenty to cover. Lucy, thank you for your time. Really interesting to hear what you've been up to, and I'll pass back to my colleague Rebecca.
Thanks, Lucy. Thanks, Vince. And so, my gosh, we've heard so much today about how land use fits into the climate agenda, and then how different types of data, geospatial, satellite data, can be used to really fuel some innovations that are trying to turn land use from a carbon emitter to a carbon sink. There's been lots of key messages there around accessibility of data, transparency, couching it in more information so that it really is easy to use for those people who might want to invest in such projects, or who really want to use this data themselves to back up some of the work that they're doing in this area. And we would love to hear from you if you have some thoughts on the topic. Do reach out on Twitter. You can use our handle @Devex. But a big thank you to our partner for this event, Satellite Applications Catapult, and a big thank you to you at home as well for watching.